On January 19th, 1943, Corporal Harold Davis walked down to a creek west of Point Cruz to fill canteens. It was a routine task. Soldiers do it every day. He had walked that path before. He knew the ground. He never heard the shot. The bullet came from somewhere above him, from the canopy of banyan trees that lined the creek edge, from a man sitting 90 feet off the ground who had been waiting since before dawn. Davis was dead before anyone could understand what direction the sound had come from. The men who found him could not identify where the shot originated. They could not see the tree. They could not see the shooter. They could not do anything except carry him back. 2 days later, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. Then 3 more died on January 21st. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree that his patrol had walked past twice that same morning without noticing anything wrong. 14 Americans killed in 72 hours, shot from trees, by men no one could locate, in a jungle that swallowed everything. The entire 132nd Infantry Battalion could not stop it. They had rifles, they had numbers, they had mortars and grenades, and the full weight of the United States military behind them. None of it mattered, because the enemy was in the trees, and the jungle hid him perfectly, and there was nothing to shoot back at. 4 days after Davis died, a man with a hunting rifle, his own commanding officer had ordered him to leave in his tent, walked into those groves alone. What happened next would change how the American military understood individual marksmanship. It almost was never allowed to happen. His name was John George, and nobody took him seriously. George was 27 years old and a second lieutenant with the Illinois National Guard when the war started. He had grown up in a household that treated shooting as a serious discipline, the way other families might treat music or mathematics, not as a hobby, as a practice, something you did with patience and precision every week for years until the fundamentals became unconscious. By 23, he was the Illinois State Rifle Champion, the youngest winner in the state's history. He shot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. He had spent more hours adjusting trigger weights and reading wind than most soldiers would spend cleaning their weapons in an entire career. When the army told him to carry a Garand M1 like everyone else, George said nothing. The Garand was a fine weapon, 8 rounds, semi-automatic, reliable in mud and heat. Half the men who carried it had never adjusted a trigger in their lives and did not need to. The army was right that the Garand was the correct rifle for most of what the infantry would face. George knew where the Garand stopped being the correct rifle, and he had spent 2 years of National Guard pay buying the answer to that problem. The Winchester Model 70 arrived in a wooden crate at Camp Forest, Tennessee, packed in cosmoline preservative grease and marked fragile. George unpacked it in the armory, set it on the workbench, and began mounting the Lyman Alaskan scope into its Griffin and Howe bracket. The battalion armorer watched him for a while. Then the armorer asked whether it was for deer or for Germans. George said it was for the Japanese. They had already received their deployment orders. Word spread through the officers within a day. The other platoon leaders started making jokes about his mail order sweetheart. One of them asked George, with complete sincerity at the mess table, whether the scope would help him see the deer better when he got home. The men at the table laughed. George ate his food and said nothing. Captain Morris, his company commander, did not laugh. Morris called him into his office and told him directly, "Leave the sporting rifle in your tent and carry a real weapon in the field." He was not unkind about it. He was practical. A bolt-action hunting rifle with a civilian scope had no place in a Pacific infantry engagement. It was weight George would have to carry through jungle terrain, weight that served no purpose. George listened to his commanding officer, acknowledged the order, and brought the rifle anyway. He packed it in a waterproof case, had it marked fragile, and arranged for it to be shipped separately when the unit deployed. Then his unit shipped without him waiting, and the rifle stayed in Illinois. George spent 3 weeks crossing the Pacific on a transport ship. He watched other men clean their garrons on the deck in the evening. He cleaned his own issued rifle alongside them. He did not know if anyone had actually sent the Winchester forward. He did not know if it would survive the ocean voyage, if they had. He thought about this sometimes at night, and then stopped thinking about it, because there was nothing to be done about it. On December 26th, a supply sergeant on Guadalcanal handed him a crate marked fragile. George opened it on his cot that night with a flashlight. He worked the Cosmoline out of the action with patches until the barrel came out clean and bright. He checked every scope mount. He dry-fired it twice in the dark, feeling the trigger break clean at 3.5 pounds. He loaded 5 rounds just to feel the weight of it ready. Then he put it back in its case, because there was still nothing to use it for. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field and held it through Japanese counterattacks that came in waves at night across open beaches. But they had not taken Mount Austin. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet above the jungle floor. The Japanese had fortified it into a system of 47 bunkers connected by tunnels, each one covering the approaches to the next. The Marines had tried to take it in November and failed. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. The terrain was the first enemy. Ridgelines too steep to assault with any cover. Kunai grass that cut through clothing and gave away movement. Approaches to each bunker that required standing up and crossing open ground, while men in reinforced fighting positions shot down into them. There was no clever solution. There was only the decision to go forward, and the price of going forward. George went forward with everyone else. He carried the Winchester in its waterproof case when the conditions allowed it, and left it cached when they did not. On the 3rd day, he set it down behind a ridge to cross an open approach, and when he came back to retrieve it, after the assault, his hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, and he sat with the rifle across his knees for a minute before he could steady himself. He never fired it once. Not on Mount Austin. Not during 16 days of fighting. The rifle was wrong for that kind of battle. Everything happened at 10 yards or 20, sometimes closer. A bolt-action scoped hunting rifle with 2.5 power magnification was designed for distances that did not exist in those ravines. George knew this before he arrived, and it did not change anything. He carried it because somewhere in this war, the distance would open up. He believed this with the certainty of someone who has spent years understanding exactly what a tool can do and exactly where it becomes irreplaceable. 34 men died taking the western slope of Mount Austin. 279 were wounded. On January 2nd, when the objective was finally secured and George's battalion came down from the ridge, he cleaned the Winchester in his tent and did not speak about it to anyone. The jungle west of Point Cruz did not look like a battlefield. That was the problem. There were no fortified positions here, no trench lines, no bunkers to identify and attack. The Japanese had moved into the coastal groves, the massive banyan trees that stood along the shore west of the Matanikau River. Some of those trees rose 90 feet with trunks the width of a car. A trained man could climb one before dawn, settle into a fork where 3 branches met, and stay there all day. He would be invisible from below. He would have clear sight lines over every trail and every creek, crossing for 300 yards in every direction. The Japanese soldiers in those trees had been chosen for this specific purpose. They carried Arisaka Type 99 rifles with 4-power scopes. They understood concealment and patience and the mathematics of angle and distance. They were not guards or sentries improvising a defensive position. They were specialists who had been placed where they would do the most damage, and they were doing it. Davis died on January 19th. 2 men from L Company died on January 20th. 5 men died on January 21st. One of them was the man shot through the neck from a tree his patrol had walked past twice. The patrol never heard anything before he went down. They carried him out and went back to their position, and there was nothing to report except that the trees were killing them, and nobody could find who was in the trees. 14 dead. An entire battalion unable to mount basic operations. Every creek crossing, every resupply run, every man moving between positions was a potential target for shooters that no one could locate from the ground. The battalion commander called George to the command post on the night of January 21st. He asked one question. He asked whether that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George told him the facts. The state championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. 23 years old, youngest winner in the state's history. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander told him he had until morning to prove it. George walked back to his tent. He sat down on his cot in the dark, opened the waterproof case, and lifted out the Winchester. He wiped it down with an oiled cloth. He checked the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of the commercial hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee, the same loads he had practiced with for years. He tried to sleep. He could not. At some point after midnight, he stopped trying and sat with the rifle across his lap in the darkness inside the tent. He was thinking about something the armorer had said back in Tennessee, about deer, about what this rifle was actually made for. Nobody in that tent on that island would have argued that John George was the right man for what was about to happen. His rifle was a toy. His ammunition was a civilian load. He had no spotter, no formal training in combat sniping, no support element, and no fallback plan. He had 15 years of practice and a very clear understanding of what this rifle could do at distance. Tomorrow morning, he would find out if that was enough. He moved into position before first light. The bunker was a Japanese construction, a low earthwork of logs and packed dirt that George's battalion had taken 3 days earlier, and then moved past without much thought. It faced west, toward the banyan groves along the coast. George stepped over a canteen near the entrance and settled into the firing position at the forward wall, a narrow slot cut through the logs at ground level. He arranged 60 rounds of ammunition within reach of his right hand. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, settled the stock against his cheek, and looked through the Lyman Alaskan scope at the tree line, 200 yards away. He could see nothing. That was expected. He waited. A sniper who has spent his career on competition ranges knows what silence sounds like. Clean silence, artificial silence, the silence of a cleared range between commands. The jungle was not silent. It was layered with sound, insects and birds, and the wind moving through the canopy. The distant sound of artillery from the east, the occasional movement of something in the undergrowth that could be an animal or could be a man. George had to filter all of it. He had to reduce everything he was hearing to a single question. Is that movement caused by wind or by something that weighs 140 pounds? He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom, then starting over. The Lyman Alaskan's 2.5 power magnification was not much, but it was the difference between seeing a branch as a branch and seeing a branch shift 3 inches in air that was not moving anywhere else. At 9:17, a branch shifted 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards west of the bunker. A small movement, a few inches, then it stopped. George watched the spot. He controlled his breathing the way he had controlled it for 15 years. Slow exhale. Hold at the bottom. Let the crosshairs settle. He watched the spot for 40 seconds without moving. The shape appeared gradually, the way shapes appear when your eyes finally understand what they are looking at. A man, dark clothing, positioned in the fork where 3 large branches met, facing east, watching the trail that George's battalion used for supply runs. The Japanese sniper had no way of knowing that on this particular morning, the most dangerous thing in the grove was not on that trail. George adjusted the scope 2 clicks right for the wind coming off the water. He let his breath out slowly. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester fired, and 240 yards away, the man in the fork of the branches jerked once and fell. He dropped through 2 lower branches without catching, his rifle going separately, and his body struck the jungle floor 90 feet below. The sound of the impact reached George a half second after he had already worked the bolt, ejected the empty case, and chambered a fresh round. He kept the scope on the tree. He did not move. He did not exhale loudly. He held position as if he had not fired at all, because what happened in the next 60 seconds mattered as much as the shot itself. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter and 1 spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and watched for targets, called positions, and provided coverage if the shooter was compromised. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere in that tree or in the adjacent trees, and he had heard the shot and felt the branch and knew exactly what had happened. George scanned, left to right, each trunk, each fork. The spotter would be moving. Moving was the mistake. At 9:43, he found the spotter 30 yards north of the first tree, 50 feet up and coming down. The man was descending carefully, one hand gripping the bark, but he was moving, and movement was all George needed. George led the motion by 18 inches, exhaled, and fired again. The second man fell without catching on anything. His rifle went down ahead of him, and both of them hit the jungle floor within 4 seconds of each other. 2 rounds fired, 2 men dead. George reloaded from a stripper clip, his hands steady, his breathing controlled. He had practiced this motion thousands of times. The motion was not the hard part. He was aware in a way that he had not fully anticipated, that the men he had just shot were not paper targets, that somewhere in the grove there were other men who had known them. He did not allow himself to stop on this thought. He brought the scope back to the tree line and resumed scanning. There was a problem in those trees that was killing Americans at a rate of 14 in 3 days, and he was the only available solution to that problem. And the solution required him to keep working. He kept working. The third sniper died at 11:03. He had repositioned to a new cluster of trees after the first pair fell, moving closer to the water where the shadows ran deeper. It was a reasonable adjustment. George found him in 11 minutes of scanning and confirmed the angle before taking the shot. The fourth died at 11:21. The spotter dropping from the same cluster, retreating down the trunk, the same way the first spotter had retreated. They had been trained the same way. They responded to pressure the same way. That consistency was information. The fifth was different. He had climbed higher than anyone else George had seen, to a crown fork, where the trunk split and the canopy began, well over 100 feet up. At that height, the cover was thinner, but the position was almost impossible to identify from below, because the human eye does not naturally search at that angle, without a specific reason to look there. George found him because of a brief glint, something metallic, catching light for less than 2 seconds. He held the scope on the spot for 4 minutes before the shape resolved into a man. He fired. The man fell for a long time before the branches slowed him. George worked the bolt and settled the crosshairs back on empty canopy. His hands were steady. They had always been steady. But in the few seconds, while he waited to see whether the position was clear, a thought moved through him that he did not usually allow during a shoot. 5 men were dead in that grove because he was better at this than they were. He did not feel guilt about this in the way that word is usually meant. The 14 Americans who had died in the past 3 days had not chosen that either. But he noticed the thought and held it for one deliberate moment, and then he set it aside. There was a problem in those trees, and he was the only solution, and the solution required him to keep going. He kept going. 8 rounds fired, 7 hits. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the grove went quiet, not silent. The insects were still there. The birds were still there. But the particular quality of ambient sound that comes from men positioned in trees, the slight adjustments in weight that shift branches, the infrequent sounds of equipment that stopped. George held position and scanned for 20 minutes without finding anything. He understood what had happened. After 5 bodies falling from trees in the same morning, the surviving Japanese snipers had stopped moving. They were in their positions, and they would not move voluntarily, because every movement had become a potential last movement. They knew something was hunting them. They did not yet know exactly what or from where, which meant they were doing exactly what George was doing. They were watching, waiting, trying to identify the problem before it identified them. George sat in the bunker with his rifle and thought about this for a while. He had come here this morning to demonstrate that the Winchester could hit targets at distance. He had demonstrated it 5 times by noon. But the situation had changed in the last hour. This was no longer a demonstration. It was a contest, and his opponents were trained professionals who had now been given 7 hours to study his location, his patterns, and his capabilities. He returned to battalion headquarters at 1600 hours and reported 8 rounds fired 5 confirmed kills. Captain Morris looked at him for a long moment before he spoke. The mockery was not in his voice anymore. He told George to be back in position at dawn. The second day began with a detail that changed the calculation entirely. The first sniper George found on January 23rd was positioned in a tree 290 yards from the bunker. Not 240, 50 yards further. George registered this immediately. That was not a coincidence of available positions. The previous day, the furthest shot he had taken was 250 yards. The Japanese had measured his engagement range from the patterns of where the bodies fell, and during the night, they had repositioned to the edge of what they estimated he could reach. They were not simply hiding in trees and waiting to be killed. They were analyzing the problem and adapting to it. Each man who died in those groves was passing information to the ones still alive. And the ones still alive were using that information. George adjusted his scope for the increased range, compensated for the slight drop in the hunting ammunition at distance, and fired. The 6th sniper fell from 290 yards. 13 minutes later, the first Japanese mortar round landed 40 yards from the bunker. George heard the distinctive sound of the launch before the impact. He was already rolling left when the round hit, pressing himself against the back wall of the bunker. The explosion threw dirt across the firing slot. He felt the concussive pressure through the log wall against his back. The mortar crew had triangulated his position, not precisely, but well enough. They had been listening for his muzzle report all morning, measuring the direction and timing of each shot from multiple positions, and now they had a grid reference. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would correct for that. George grabbed the Winchester and ran. He was 40 yards north of the bunker when the third salvo hit. The log structure he had been using for 3 hours disappeared in a column of dirt and smoke and fragmented wood. The blast threw debris across the ground behind him. He kept running until he reached a fallen tree 120 yards from where the bunker had been, dropped behind it, and brought the rifle up. He lay still and got his breathing back under control. Around him, the grove was full of sound again, not the ordinary sound of birds and insects, the sound of men who believed they had solved their problem. They had not solved their problem. George settled behind the fallen tree, found a stable rest for the Winchester on the bark, and went back to work. By 1700 hours, he had killed 8 men. That night, in his tent, George cleaned the Winchester and did the arithmetic. 11 snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained. And those 3 were the most experienced men in the group, because experience was the only explanation for how they had survived this long. The least skilled had died in the first hours. What was left were the ones who had been watching everything, learning everything, waiting. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 0300, he gave up, sat on his cot in the dark, and began thinking about where he would position himself at dawn. Not in the bunker, not behind the fallen tree. Somewhere the 3 remaining men would not expect, because the 3 remaining men now knew exactly how he thought. The contest had changed again. It was no longer a man with a rifle hunting snipers in a grove. It was 3 trained specialists who had survived by being the best, against 1 man with a hunting rifle that everyone else had called a toy. And all 3 of them were still alive, precisely because they were better at this than anyone George had faced before. George stopped sleeping at 0300. He had tried for 3 hours. He lay on his cot in his tent and went through what he knew about the 3 men still alive in those groves. They were the survivors. In any group of professionals operating under sustained lethal pressure, the survivors at the end of the 3rd day are not simply the lucky ones. They are the ones who made better decisions than everyone else, consistently, over 3 days of dying. They had watched 8 colleagues get killed. They had observed patterns, adapted positions, coordinated the mortar response. Whatever mistakes the others had made, these 3 had not made those mistakes. They also knew his methods now. They had seen where the shots came from, measured his distances, mapped his positions. The bunker was destroyed. The fallen tree was compromised. They would expect him to select a new position in the same general area, because that area commanded the best sight lines into the grove. If he thought about where he would position himself to cover the approach to the grove from the east, and assumed they were thinking the same thing, then anywhere obvious was a trap. George got up at 0415 and started moving in the rain. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous positions. Marines had used it as a machine gun nest in December. It was not the highest point in the area and not the most obvious firing position, which meant it was less likely to be covered. He settled in before first light and pulled his back under the rock overhang to keep the ammunition dry. The rain came down hard enough that he could not have seen 20 yards, even if there had been light to see by. He waited. The rain stopped at 0743. Visibility came back slowly. Gray light filling in between the trees, the canopy dripping. George brought the Winchester up and began scanning. At 0817, he found the first target of the day, a palm tree 190 yards northwest of his position. The sniper was 40 feet up, not 90, not the elevated position that everyone else had chosen. He was positioned inside the fronds where they spread from the trunk, his body almost entirely concealed from below. From ground level, he would have been invisible. George was not at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks, looking down at a slight angle into the palm fronds, and the angle gave him a view that no one approaching from the trail would have. He could see the shape of the man's shoulders and the outline of a rifle. He settled the crosshairs, adjusted for wind, began to squeeze the trigger. He stopped. He held position without moving for a long moment. The crosshairs stayed on the shape in the palm fronds. His breathing stayed controlled. Something was wrong. He could not name it immediately. It was not a sound or a specific visual detail. It was the position itself. 40 feet was low. Everyone else had gone high. 60 feet, 90 feet. Because height maximized sight lines and made the shooter harder to identify from below. This man was at 40 feet, a level where an alert patrol could have spotted him from the ground on a clear morning. He had chosen concealment over elevation, which was a legitimate tactical choice, but the specific position, at the exact range where George had been engaging targets, in a tree whose angle made it visible from rocks that were one of the few remaining uncompromised positions in the area, felt too convenient. George was looking at a shot he could make with his eyes closed, against men who had survived 3 days by not making mistakes. He lowered the rifle 2 inches and started scanning the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the covering shooter would be positioned to observe anyone who took the shot. watching for muzzle flash or movement, waiting for George to fire and reveal his location. He would be in a tree with a clear line of sight to this position, or to the positions George had used on previous days. George scanned methodically, left to right, full arc, looking for the same thing he always looked for, a shape that did not belong in the tree structure, a piece of symmetry that nature doesn't produce. He checked every trunk within 300 yards, every fork, every cluster of branches at every height. The specific difficulty of this kind of search was that it could not be rushed. Moving the scope too quickly meant missing the detail he was looking for. But moving it slowly, knowing that someone who understood he was in the area might be running the same search in return, required a discipline that existed somewhere beyond patience. George was aware, at some level, that he might already be visible to someone he had not yet found, that the next shot fired in this grove might not be his decision. He did not let that thought move faster than the scan. It took 11 minutes. He found it in a banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The position was almost perfect. Branches and vines covered 3 sides of it. The shooter faced east, toward the fallen tree where George had worked the previous afternoon, toward the drainage ditch 50 yards further east, where someone retreating from the rocks might logically take cover. He was waiting for George to appear in one of those places, or to fire from those positions after taking the shot at the palm. George had 2 problems. The first was mechanical. If he fired at the real sniper and missed, or even if he hit, the bolt-action Winchester required him to work the lever and chamber a fresh round before he could fire again. That took just under 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough time for the shooter in the palm to acquire him and engage. The second was strategic. The real sniper was watching the wrong location. His coverage was oriented toward the east. If George fired at him, the sound of the shot would reveal where George actually was, and the man had the reaction time and the skill to turn and respond before George could reload. The only advantage George currently held was that neither of them knew exactly where the other was. As soon as he fired, he would lose that. He needed to solve both problems at the same time. He looked at the man in the palm tree, the decoy, the piece of bait that 8 dead men had apparently never had the patience to question. Then he thought about what would happen in the 2 seconds after he shot the decoy. The real shooter would hear the report and turn toward it. He was 91 feet up and oriented east. Turning toward the sound meant turning roughly southwest. That turn required movement. Movement from 90 feet up against a light sky would be visible. George brought the crosshairs back to the shape in the palm fronds. He adjusted for wind. He controlled his breathing. He fired. The man in the palm tree jerked and fell through the fronds. George heard the body hit the lower branches. He was already moving the rifle northwest, swinging it 80 yards to the banyan, pushing the crosshairs up toward 90 feet. The real shooter was turning. There, a slight shift of shape against the sky, a shoulder rotating, a rifle barrel coming around. The man had not yet completed the turn. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the turn could finish. The second body came down through the branches. Both of them hit the ground within seconds of each other. George grabbed his ammunition and moved. He went east along the rock line, low and fast, dropped into a drainage ditch 30 yards away. and pressed himself flat into the mud. He was counting in his head from the moment of the second shot. At 6 seconds, the rocks he had left erupted, machine gun fire sustained, raking across the stones from somewhere in the tree line to the northwest. The bullets shattered rock and threw fragments across the ground. The firing lasted 17 seconds and then stopped. Silence. Then the sounds of the jungle filling back in. George lay in the drainage ditch and did not move for 90 seconds. He was aware of several things simultaneously. That he was covered in mud, that his heart rate was considerably elevated, that both targets were confirmed dead, and that there had been at least one more enemy position observing this entire area that he had not accounted for. He had gotten the 2 snipers, but someone had been watching when he moved. He relocated again, this time 100 yards east, to a crater left by a mortar or artillery round sometime earlier in the campaign. It was half full of rainwater. George lowered himself over the edge and settled into the water, which came to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim with the barrel pointing into the grove, and he held the stock vertical to keep water out of the action. The water was cold. He had been in the field for 10 hours. He did not move. 10 minutes passed. 20. Somewhere in the grove, the 3 remaining positions from this morning had been reduced to 1. 10 men were dead. 1 remained. The one who was left was the last survivor of a group of 11. He had watched 10 men die and adapted to each death. He had survived the mortar setup, the decoy trap, 3 days of escalating pressure. He had been in those groves since before George arrived, and he was still alive. George did not allow himself to underestimate what that meant. He glassed the tree line again, sweeping the scope across the same arc he had been covering all morning. He checked the high positions first, then the mid-range, then the lower concealment points. He checked the specific tree where the real shooter had been. He checked the adjacent trees. At 09:47, he understood that he had been looking in the wrong place. There was movement at the southern edge of his peripheral vision, not in the trees, on the ground. 60 yards south, something was moving through the undergrowth, parallel to the rock line. Low, slow, using the ferns and fallen branches for cover the way a man would if he had been trained not to move against the skyline. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving directly toward George's last known position. George did not move. The shape in his peripheral vision was 60 yards south, moving low through the undergrowth, using the vegetation the way a trained man uses it, staying below the level where movement creates a silhouette, stopping frequently, advancing in short intervals, and then holding still long enough to listen. From a distance, in shadow, the movement could have been a deer or a large bird. But deer do not stop and listen, and birds do not crawl parallel to a rock line where a sniper had been positioned 2 hours earlier. George sank lower in the water. The crater was chest deep at its center. He lowered himself until the water reached his chin, then kept going until only his eyes and the top of his head were above the surface. He held the Winchester vertically, stock below the waterline, barrel pointing at the sky, keeping the bore dry. He had been in the water for over an hour. He was cold in the specific way that makes you stop registering the cold and simply accept it as the temperature of existence. He watched the shape move through the undergrowth. The 11th sniper reached the rock cluster at 1003. He moved up to the machine gun nest where George had been positioned that morning and took a firing position facing east, toward the drainage ditch and the general area where someone retreating from the rocks under fire would logically have gone. His back was fully exposed to George's position in the crater, 38 yards away. An easy shot. Well inside the range, George had been working all week. Center mass at 38 yards required almost no adjustment for drop or wind. He could have made it without the scope. He did not take it, because the man in the rocks was sitting in the most exposed position available in the area, with his back to the most likely concealment point for a man who had survived by never staying in obvious places. No sniper who had outlasted 10 of his colleagues in 3 days would sit in the open with his back to cover unless he expected someone in that cover to engage him. George expanded his scan to the surrounding terrain without moving his head. He moved only his eyes, working the arc slowly. Fallen log 20 yards northwest, stand of palms to the left, the tree line beginning 40 yards north. At 1006, he found the second man, behind a fallen tree trunk 70 yards northwest of the rocks, completely still, his rifle resting across the bark and aimed at the drainage ditch to the east. This man was not the 11th sniper. This was someone else entirely, which meant that what George had calculated as one remaining was actually two, and that one of them was now sitting in the open as bait with a colleague covering the approach. They were hunting him the way he had been hunting them, with patience, with a partner, with a setup designed to force him into a position where he was already in the crosshairs before he pulled the trigger. George was inside their trap, and they did not know it, because the trap was aimed 20 yards to his right. He processed this information without allowing it to change his breathing or his position. He had 3 rounds remaining in the Winchester, 2 targets, separated by 70 yards, both of whom would react and relocate the instant the first shot was fired. A bolt-action rifle required just under 2 seconds to cycle between shots. At 70 yards, a trained man who heard a shot and understood he was compromised could move behind his cover in less than 2 seconds. He could not shoot both of them before one of them moved. He submerged lower. He went until the water covered his mouth, then his nose, and he tilted his head back until only his eyes remained above the surface. The water around him was brown with mud and tasted like iron. He kept the Winchester vertical in his right hand, the stock resting on the crater floor below him, the barrel above the waterline. He breathed very slowly through his nose, and he waited. At 10:13, the man in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He straightened, turned toward his partner behind the fallen tree, and gave a hand signal. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, walking slowly, scanning the ground. They believed George had retreated further east during the machine gun response. They were sweeping his likely withdrawal route. They walked past the crater. George waited until both men had cleared his position by 15 yards. Both of them were facing east. Both of them had their backs to him now, walking away, moving toward ground where George no longer was. He rose from the water. He came up slowly, without sound, letting the water run off his face and his shirt without rushing anything. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. The stock was dry. The scope was dry. He found the closer man in the crosshairs, the one who had been in the rocks, now 42 yards ahead and walking east. He fired. The man dropped without turning. George worked the bolt and swung right, covering the 40 yards to the second man in the same motion. The second man was already reacting to the sound, beginning to turn, his rifle starting to come around. George fired before the turn completed. The second man fell forward and did not move. George stood at the edge of the water-filled crater with an empty bolt and 2 dead men at 40 and 30 yards, and thought, for exactly 1 second, that it was over. Then he heard voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line to the north. Multiple men. The sound of branches moving. Boot steps on wet ground. Not the careful movement of snipers. The heavier, faster movement of infantry who had heard shots and were coming toward the sound. George dropped back into the crater. The voices grew louder. He counted what he could distinguish. At least 6 men, possibly more, moving toward the 2 fallen soldiers. He reloaded the Winchester from his last stripper clip. 5 rounds. He listened to the voices reach the first body, the conversation that followed, the different tone in the second exchange when they found the second man. Then silence. Then the voices shifted direction. They were coming toward him. George understood what had happened before he could stop it from happening. He had been careful about sound for 4 days. He had been careful about movement. He had thought about mortar triangulation and machine gun coverage and decoy positions. He had not thought about boot prints in the mud, because when the machine gun opened up that morning, he had sprinted without looking down, and he had left a trail in the soft ground, from the rocks to the drainage ditch, to the crater, that anyone could follow. 4 days of exact and careful work, and 1 sprint in the wrong direction had left a route that led directly to where he was lying. He had 5 rounds. There were at least 6 of them, at 25 yards and closing. He heard one of them stop at the crater edge. He looked up. A Japanese soldier was standing at the rim of the crater, looking directly into it, and their eyes met across 4 feet of open air. And in that moment, there was no tactic and no calculation. There was only the fact of another human being who understood at exactly the same instant what was about to happen. George fired from inside the water. The soldier fell backward off the rim. George was already working the bolt before the man finished falling, pushing himself upright, getting the barrel above the waterline. 2 more soldiers were at the rim when he came up. He fired once, cycled the bolt, and fired again. Both of them went down. 3 rounds left. He was out of the crater and running north before the shouting started. He had no grip on the distance or direction of the other voices. He only knew they were behind him and closing. He ran through the jungle undergrowth the way a man runs when there is nothing left to think about. Legs driving, arms pulling branches away from his face. The Winchester in his right hand, catching on vines that tore free as he broke through them. Rifle fire behind him, cracking through the canopy, hitting bark and ground, aimed at sound and movement. He dove behind a fallen tree after 90 seconds and pressed himself against it and listened. The voices had stopped pursuing. He could hear them at the crater position, behind him, reorganizing. He had 2 rounds left. His pack, containing the rest of his ammunition, was somewhere in the mud near the water-filled crater. He had 2 rounds, a rifle that was now carrying more mud than it should, and no clear knowledge of how many of them were still behind him. He began moving northeast, not running, walking low, using the terrain. taking 40 seconds between movements to listen. The jungle was quiet around him. He moved by intervals, stop and listen, move and stop, the way he had moved into position every morning for 4 days, except now the direction was away from the problem instead of toward it. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself and was led through. He walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. The numbers were clinical in the way that accurate numbers always are. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired during sniper operations, 11 hits. Then a separate engagement with Japanese infantry. 5 rounds, 3 confirmed kills. 2 rounds expended creating distance for withdrawal. Current ammunition status, 2 rounds. Current rifle status, functional but requiring cleaning. Mud in the action. Some moisture in the barrel. Morris told him to clean the rifle and rest. George went back to his tent and field stripped the Winchester on his cot and spent 2 hours working mud out of every component with batches and solvent and gun oil, pushing cloths through the barrel until they came out clean. He had not slept properly in 4 days. His hands were steady while he cleaned the rifle, and he was not sure what to make of that. At 1400 hours, a runner came from headquarters. George walked across the camp to the battalion command post. Captain Morris was there. 2 other officers were with him. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done in those groves? George said he could try. He said it would take time, and men who could already shoot, and rifles with optics. Ferry told him that division headquarters had 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes left behind by the Marines, and 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. He wanted George to create a sniper section, train them from the ground up, take them into the field, and clear whatever the Japanese left behind as they began pulling troops off the island. George accepted. Then he told the colonel there was one condition. He wanted to keep the Winchester. Ferry approved it without hesitation. George walked back to his tent. He picked up the Winchester and held it for a moment. Looked at it the way you look at a thing that has been through something with you that you cannot fully explain to someone who was not there. Then he set it down, sat on his cot, and finally slept. Training began on January 27th, 5 days after George had walked back through the American perimeter, with 2 rounds left in the Winchester, and mud in places that would take a week to fully clean out. Colonel Ferry gave him 40 men and 14 Springfield rifles fitted with inertial scopes. The 40 men were expert marksmen on paper, the highest qualification category the Army issued. What the paper did not record was that not one of them had ever identified a human target in a tree at 200 yards, or controlled their breathing when something in the jungle was trying to locate them, or understood the difference between a shot they could make and a shot they should take. George had 12 days before the battalion needed the section operational. He spent 3 days on fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, reading wind across broken terrain, understanding what 2.5 power magnification actually showed you versus what your eyes told you it showed you. Then he taught them observation, how to scan, how to find the specific type of shape that does not belong in a tree structure, how long to hold on a position before deciding it was empty. Then he organized them into 2-man teams and put them in the field. the sniper section operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 American casualties during sniper operations. Every man in George's team came back from every engagement. The Army recorded these numbers in the regimental history and moved on, because there was an entire island to finish, and the Japanese were already pulling their troops off Guadalcanal in destroyers that came in at night and left before dawn. The war was heading somewhere else. So was George. He volunteered for Burma in March, 3 weeks after the sniper section was formally dissolved. A unit of 3,000 men, no motorized transport, no artillery support, carrying everything on their backs through terrain that Japanese commanders considered impossible for any organized force. Their mission was to advance 700 miles through the Burmese jungle and capture the Myitkyina airfield, which mattered enormously to Allied supply routes into China. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. George packed the Winchester in a waterproof case and had it loaded into the cargo hold of the transport ship. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver 330, 8 ounces less. Because over 700 miles of jungle terrain, every ounce counted more than it had on Guadalcanal. He modified the stock. He reduced the total weight by 14 ounces. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944 and began walking. George used the Winchester 7 times in 3 months. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. 5 more times in engagements distributed across the length of the march. 7 shots, 7 kills, and then nothing, because Burma was not point crews. The fighting in Burma happened at 50 yards or less. Ambushes in dense vegetation where you could not see 15 feet in any direction. Firefights that started and ended in seconds. In terrain where a scoped bolt-action rifle was the wrong architecture for the problem. The same way it had been wrong on Mount Austin. The Garand was right for Burma. The Winchester was right for something else. George understood this, and it was not a disappointment to him. This understanding was actually the most important thing he had learned from the 4 days in the Point Cruz groves, that a tool is not good or bad in the abstract. A tool is specifically suited or specifically mismatched for a specific problem. What he had proved at Point Cruz was not that the Winchester was better than the Garand. He had proved that in certain conditions, with certain preparation, the specific capabilities of a precision bolt-action rifle with high-quality optics could solve a problem that nothing else available could solve. The Army had not designed a context for that capability to exist in. George had found one. He understood, walking through the Burmese jungle with the Winchester in its waterproof case on his back and a Garand in his hands, that the most important skill was not knowing how to shoot. It was knowing which tool the situation required, and having spent enough time with that tool to deploy it at the moment when the context aligned. On February 7th, 1944, a Japanese rifleman shot George through the left shoulder during an engagement near the Tanai River. The bullet passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Corporal Hayes dragged him to cover and called for a medic. George was evacuated to a field hospital and spent 2 weeks recovering. By the time he was cleared for duty, the Marauders had captured Myitkyina airfield, and the campaign was effectively over. The unit was disbanded. The men who had entered Burma with 5,300 soldiers, had lost more than 2,000 to disease and combat and exhaustion. Most of the casualties were disease. The jungle killed more men than the enemy did. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He arrived at Fort Benning in the summer of 1944. The base was full of the organized sound of an army moving in both directions at once. Units shipping out and units coming back. Recruits being taught things that veterans had already learned at considerable cost in places the recruits could not yet imagine. George had been in the Pacific for 18 months. He had come back with a shoulder wound that was healing cleanly, a rifle that had killed 14 men, and then been carried for 700 miles, barely used, and the particular kind of quiet that settles into a person after they have been in the kind of places where John George had been and are now standing somewhere ordinary. He spent the last year of the war teaching infantry officers marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught both environments, the open sight lines of point crews, where patience and precision were decisive, and the close ambush terrain of Burma, where almost none of that applied. He taught men how to ask the right question before they selected a weapon, which was not whether they could make the shot, but whether this situation was the kind of situation where a precise shot at 200 yards was the answer. Most situations were not. George knew this. He had been in both kinds. He kept the Winchester. It had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, to Georgia. It had been submerged in a water-filled crater with only its barrel above the surface. It had been cleaned in the dark with a flashlight while soldiers moved through trees 30 yards away. It had been lightened by 14 ounces and carried through 700 miles of jungle where it was barely needed. It was the same rifle the armorer had called a toy 3 years earlier. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, George decided to write down what had happened, not for publication, for himself and for whoever came after him, who might need to know. He wanted to document the weapons and the tactics and the specific decisions and why they worked or did not work, while the details were still clear. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript reached 400 pages. A contact at the National Rifle Association read it and suggested it should be published. George was reluctant. The book was technical. It was about bullets and ballistics and the mechanical properties of different rifle actions and what each type of scope, magnification, actually gave you at what range. It was not a story about heroism. It was a manual written by a craftsman who wanted other craftsmen to have accurate information. The NRA convinced him. The book was published under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a reference work. Military historians cited it. Firearms collectors and researchers cited it. The descriptions of Japanese weapons in the book remain some of the most accurate contemporary accounts available, because George had observed them at close range under conditions that produced exactly the kind of detailed attention that a man pays when the information might save his life. The book is still in print. George returned to civilian life, studied at Princeton on the GI Bill, eventually worked in African affairs through the State Department and the Institute of African American Relations. He did not speak publicly about point crews. He did not talk about the sniper section or the Winchester at conferences or dinners. His colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. They did not know the details. He did not think the details were the point. John George died on January 3rd, 2009. He was 90 years old. His family donated the Winchester Model 70 to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it was placed in a display case with a placard describing its history. There is a rifle in that case right now. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like a hunting rifle because it is a hunting rifle. There is nothing about its appearance that communicates what it did or what it cost to do it, or how close it came to never being used at all. The placard explains some of it. The placard cannot explain what it meant to carry it through 18 pounds of institutional skepticism across an ocean, to watch it sit useless for 3 weeks on a ship, and then for 16 days on a mountain, to wait for the exact moment when the context and the tool and the preparation aligned. The Army spent the next 40 years learning, slowly and at considerable cost in other theaters, what John George demonstrated in 4 days in January of 1943, that in the right circumstances, a single person with the right tool and the right preparation will accomplish what a battalion could not. That individual precision is not a relic of an older kind of warfare. That the question is never whether the tool is serious. The question is whether the person behind it understands exactly what it can do and is willing to carry it far enough to find out. The Army eventually built a formal sniper program. The curriculum referenced lessons that went back to Guadalcanal. Some of those lessons were written in a 400-page technical manual by a man who had not intended to write a book about heroism. The rifle sits in the case in Virginia. Most people walk past. It looks like a toy,